Okay.
Okay, so today, oh, sorry, Bridget, hold on. Let me. Today we're talking about eye tracking technology in the garden center. While this technology and its applications is fairly commonly used in the department store world, our expert today has been working on it and its applications to horticulture. She'll let us know what independent garden centers can implement and action immediately in order to benefit from some of the things. Our expert today is Dr. Bridget Behe with two long E's, so my apologies for pronouncing it wrong on the call to land earlier. And Bridget is currently a professor of horticultural marketing at Michigan State University. She teaches courses on marketing and management for horticulture majors. Bridget has conducted over 100 consumer and market research projects on horticultural products, both edible and ornamental. She has written more than 500 publications in the trade press and peer-reviewed journals. She joined Michigan State's faculty in August 1997 after serving on the faculty at Auburn University in Alabama for 8 years. Bridget earned degrees from Penn State University, a PhD in horticulture, a BS in horticulture, and a BS in agricultural education, and the Ohio State University, an MS in horticulture. Each year, she speaks to professionals and industry groups nationally and internationally. She writes articles for several other trade magazines to share the findings of her consumer research studies. She was co-chair of the American Hort, formerly OFA Garden Center Committee for several years, and now serves on the Retail Committee. This year, Dr. Behe was elected to chair a USDA Regional Project Committee where horticulturalists and agricultural, oh my goodness gracious, economists work collaboratively on consumer and economic challenges facing the ornamental horticulture industry. In 2013, she was awarded the National Service Award by the Michigan Floral Association, and in 2012 was named the Outstanding Established Teacher in the College of Agriculture, and in 2016 was awarded the Outstanding Extension Specialist in Michigan. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bridget.
Thanks, Dustin. No prairies today. We're going to talk pretty much exclusively about marketing. And I appreciate you tuning in today. Hopefully you'll find a couple of good tidbits that will be applicable to your garden center. So we're going to talk about, oops, why is my slide not changing, Dustin? Let's see here. Let's see.
Oh,
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've been doing here at Michigan State, but before we get into some of the research-based information, I want to share with you the technology that we're using. And you'll see here on the left a woman who is wearing these really cool Tobii eye tracking glasses. And what makes these glasses so special is they have two cameras over each eye, and this can triangulate through this camera here in the center and identify with great precision what the individual is looking at. You can see a picture over here. There really isn't much to these glasses other than the magic of the cameras. And the reason that we use these is vision, or our eyesight, is very subconscious. We don't think about, well, I'm going to look here and then I'm going to look there. It's very task specific. So when we ask shoppers to find the best plant or find a plant for $10 or less, what we can understand from monitoring their eye movement is the information that they're using to make the decision. So we're able to get objective data about a process, about a purchase decision that really we've not been able to get this objectively ever. And so that's one of the reasons that we've migrated to use this technology to help us understand how people are moving through the garden center, what it is that they're looking at. And the goal is obviously to sell more plants. But we believe that if we can make that shopping process easier, smoother, and faster for consumers, that it's going to also be a win for the retailers. So ultimately, our goal is to help consumers have a very positive shopping experience, and that positive shopping experience hopefully is going to lead them to be successful at home. So there's kind of two elements that we're trying to look at. We want them to get the best plant in the right place, but a lot of that has to originate, to start with that shopping experience in the garden center. Now, you know, visually we want people to know that this business is a plant retailer. We need to make it very clear at a very high rate of speed exactly what the business does. And so large swaths of color, particularly in the spring, are very eye-catching. And even if you had snow up to the bottom of this sign, it's pretty clear what this business is about with some of the color and some of the flowers behind it. So a lot of the shopping process really starts on the road with reminding consumers this is the type of business that we are in. Now, a lot of garden centers are not brand spanking new and not placed all at one time, and so we've built this piece on here and that piece on there. And one of the easy visual cues that we can use to literally point the entryway is the use of chevrons over the entryway. So chevrons act as a subliminal arrow, if you will, to help consumers understand, oh, I'm supposed to go in here. And it's really amazing how much of a difference these angular structures over an entryway have, the importance that they have in helping people understand I'm supposed to go here. Now, obviously an entrance sign is very helpful, but I would encourage you to think about your entryway, particularly for next spring, and are you literally pointing the way into the garden center? Now, once you're inside the door, we know consumers are incredibly time-strapped. And so there are kind of two schools of thought with what we should do at this entryway. One school of thought is we give people a landing strip, much like we leave space on a runway for a plane to land. We need to give consumers some almost blank space, if you will, to change gears mentally from I was driving here, or what am I going to fix for supper, or what practices do I have to run the kids to. So there's an older school of thought that says we need to give consumers kind of this blank landing space. But more recent research tells us that really this entryway can act as a very strong visual cue about the merchandise that's inside and about some of the specials. So I think for now, either of those is going to be correct. Old school says give consumers some space, and new thinking says we should put some colorful product for sale in the entryway, but we'll need to do a little more research before we have real definitive information there. Now, once they're inside, visually, they've got to figure out, where are the plants, where are the products that I'm essentially most interested in. And I really like this sign. By the time I figured out where the product is, they've moved it. So let's talk about navigation just a little bit. Absolutely, positively, the worst form of navigation is alphabetical. If you think about it, there are only a few places that you shop alphabetically. One of those is probably the music store, if you still go someplace to buy your music, and a bookstore. But the reason that we orient customers alphabetically in the garden center is really to make it easy for us and our employees. That's not a very natural shopping mechanism. So it's nice, it's neat, but it's not really the ideal. What our research shows is we need to orient consumers to where they are and help them understand where different products and where different categories of inspiration can be found. But this "you are here" dot is really important, because without orienting people to their immediate surroundings, they're going to use a lot of time, a lot of cognitive resources. They're going to have to think about now, where am I and how do I get to this one area of the store? And it really turns people off. It slows them down, and it reduces the sales. And another thing that we need to consider visually is some of these what we might call barriers to entry. When people are shopping, maybe it's on their lunch hour, maybe it's right after work and they're headed home, still in their work clothes. This puddle of water is going to act as a very strong subliminal barrier. People don't want to walk through that type of what we might normally find at a nursery or garden center, because they don't know how deep it is, they don't know if it's going to get their shoes dirty, and they probably have somewhat nicer clothes on. So we need to think about those walkway materials just a little bit. Now, another visual cue is how we arrange the benches. So I suspect a great deal of you, many of us, this is kind of the traditional way that we arrange benches, what I would call cornrows. And so an alternative to that might be to angle those benches ever so slightly, almost a 45-degree angle as opposed to a 90-degree angle, toward the consumer. And what we see happening is as they walk down toward a destination, when they pass the cornrow, they're going to literally have to turn their head 90 degrees to be able to see to the left and to the right. However, when they walk down an aisle where the benches are turned towards them at a 45-degree angle, they can visually see more merchandise up and down those side benches. Let me show you, for example. This is Romance Gardens in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so this is maybe not the ideal destination point, but you see this very long visual walkway. And what Romance has done is they've turned a few of these benches to the 45-degree angle. So let's imagine we're going to walk down that bench a step or two. Now I can see a lot of the product. Maybe an end cap here would be helpful. But even as I get to this next row, I visually can see much more of the product, and it's more inviting for me as a consumer to walk down that aisle. When we get up in between the benches, you can see how much more of the product I can see very easily simply by turning my head ever so slightly to the left or to the right, depending on which way the benches are oriented, and I get great perspective on all the product almost even to the very end of that bench. And again, I would suggest a very compelling end cap here, something that might help inspire consumers to continue down that aisle. So kind of from the top, what we see these 45-degree chevroned benches doing is helping consumers navigate the walkways a little bit more easily, not having to stretch or crane their neck, but really to expose them visually to more product and to draw people into and through that store. Let's talk about bench height for a moment or two. And again, I think many folks have been using a pretty standard height, but let's imagine a person who is, I'm 5 foot tall, not very well versed in the metrics, so you know, we've got about a 5 foot tall person here. If we have a bench that is 1 meter tall and 1.2 meters wide, not terribly unusual in the retail arena today, they can see a very narrow visual field. If we lower that bench 1/4 of a meter, I increase my visual field tremendously. It's still the same width of the bench, but I can see much further. And if I reduce that a little bit more to 1/2 meter tall, somewhere around knee high, I can absolutely get the entire perspective of the whole bench. So what this does in practice is it helps consumers visually see more of the product in the same amount of space. Now, what Terrain Garden Center has done here is about that 1/2 meter tall bench. Notice that there are a lot of perennials and some shrubs. I think there are some shrubs further back in this display. And so it doesn't quite place them on the floor or the ground where they would be growing, and we don't want consumers to bend over that far. But what it does is it produces a more realistic type of garden exposure. It's still, the product is still within arm's length, but I can see much more of that product visually simply by lowering that bench height. So another retailer, Sears, here in Western Michigan, I think has adapted this visual perspective quite nicely. Now, what I like about these fixtures is this is about 1/2 meter tall. We're getting close to 3/4 of a meter here. Consumers can still have that overhead perspective. I've got very nice tiering at this end cap where I can place product at 3 different levels. Not real crazy about this one on the floor, but I do like these other 2. And additionally, what I like about this is the color contrast that we're creating, because these ferns now literally pop on that very dark color. Now, it does make the retailer think a little bit ahead of time about what products we're going to merchandise on what different fixtures and how do we create the greatest contrast. But I will tell you that, you know, the green really stands out nicely against this very dark color, and so they've picked kind of a darker neutral color for uniformity and also to help make the green and some of the flowering plants really pop against that particular fixture. So think about the height, think about the color, not necessarily on every single bench in the retail garden center, but strategically where consumers are entering maybe main aisles. Think about angling some of the benches at that 45-degree angle and see what you might be willing to do with some different colored fixtures for next spring, and see what effect that has on consumer purchases. So a little more about merchandising, and this comes from an interesting study which was published in a book by Barry Schwartz called The Paradox of Choice. Now, Iyengar and Leopard published this study back in 2000, and it was a very famous jam purchasing story. And so when they had 6 flavors of, or 6 flavors of jams versus 24 flavors of jams, you would think that with the 24 flavors of jams that you would sell much more jams, and that was not the case. So while having 24 flavors attracted 60% of shoppers, on average they only sampled 2 flavors, but the proof here, only 3% bought product. When we had 6 choices, it only attracted 40% of the shoppers. They still sampled about the same number. But look at what reducing the number of choices did to sales. And so one of the studies that we did this past spring looked at displays of 6, 12, or 24 plants. And on this left side, these displays only had one genus. There are different colors, but they're all impatiens. And then we exposed the same consumers to 24 plants of 2, 3, or 4 genera. Now, we did this over a number of days. We had pretty close to 100 individuals, and I want to share with you some of the key take-home findings from this study. So what we see here are looking at 6, 12, or 24 plants, and these are some of the actual displays. What we saw first of all was that whether we had 6, 12, or 24 plants, there was no difference in the time to choice. But where we saw a difference was when we showed consumers 6 plants, they saw 87% of them. When we doubled that, they only saw 70%. And when we went to 24 plants, they saw less than half of the plants. So when we create these masses of color, they are very visually interesting. But much like the jelly experiment, they're very overwhelming to many consumers. And so it's tough for them to see very deep into the display, and they don't see nearly as many plants. Let's look at their choice next. So now we see the 24 of one genus, 2 genera, 3 genera, and 4 genera. So we're increasing the complexity. Now, people were more likely to buy, that's what this top rating is, they were more likely to buy when we had 4 genera. And that makes a lot of sense. You have a very diverse display. Most people are going to find something in there that they like. Now, just like the smaller displays, people were spending less than a minute and a half to make the choice, and there was no difference based upon the number of genera. What also was interesting is we've kind of, we've kind of held constant at about this 45% of the plants. Now here, where we show them 4 species, they're only looking at 36% of the plants. So people are processing mentally only a certain number of plants. Now, we increase the diversity, they're more likely to buy something. That time to choice is still the same, and that's good because we're not increasing them standing there really having to think hard about which plant to buy. But again, when we start overwhelming consumers with many, many plants, what is physiologically happening is they're not looking at very many of them. Now, which plants are they looking at? First of all, let's talk about time to choice. Now, it makes a lot of sense that people make a decision to buy something in the front row very quickly. In fact, it took consumers 12.8 seconds to buy something in the front row compared to 15 or 16 seconds in the back row. It's also interesting for us to see that people make a faster choice when the plant is on the left. And this makes a lot of sense to me because we're going to pick something in the front. We can see almost all of that plant, and we're going to pick something from the left because in our culture, that's how we read. We read left to right. It was also interesting that it didn't take any more or less time for a consumer to pick a plant that was priced at $1.99 versus $3.99. What were they more likely to buy? While the decision time was faster on the left, they were more likely to buy a plant on the right. And what we think is happening here is they start on the left and they visually move across the front of that display, and so we get a little more dwell time on the right, and maybe they're seeing something they like a little bit closer to their right hand, which is what the handedness was of most of our consumers. So they visually start on the left and progress to the right, and we think because it's so proximate to their right hand that that is why they're picking up some of the plant material on the right. We were absolutely delighted to see that consumers were more likely to buy a lower priced product than a higher priced product, and it's great when research results are logical, fairly intuitive. But this last piece here, the percent likely to buy from the front row, was huge. Almost half of our subjects selected a plant from the front. And so what I think this is leading us to recommend is to put the very best plant material up front and to make sure that displays are stocked very well with prime product up front. We can maybe get away with less quality material towards the back because we know consumers visually are not going to get back there. And these tremendously large, overwhelming displays of color are great to attract attention, but we really see where the rubber meets the road. We see up front and on the right where most of the action is happening, and we have to be very aware of that to keep these displays fresh so that it doesn't turn people off if they have to go through multiple rows or the very best stuff is not up front. Now, another piece to displays is context, and it's not just how much merchandise, how high off the floor, but I want to talk about context. Displays are really important, and part of that is because context matters. It doesn't take very many trips to the grocery store anymore for us to understand that really good displays often demonstrate use. You know, and all you have to do is go to an IKEA store to understand this principle as well. And so putting product, whether it's food or furniture or plants, putting that in context is essential to the profit margin that we can garner from that particular product. Let me show you some of the results of some other work that we've been doing. Now, we've got a picture of basil here, and this plant, like many plants, has utilitarian or functional attributes. It can function as a season or a garnish. There are different ways that we could use that, but it has utility, it has value. And oftentimes, when we market plants, we kind of tend to market them very much as I'm showing this plant on the left, very much like a plant in space. However, hedonic attributes, and many plants have both utilitarian and hedonic attributes, but the pleasurable attributes, the real sensory attributes, come alive when we begin to put the plant in context. Let me talk about this a little bit more. Let's take a brand like Urban Outfitters, for example. And many of our subjects, when we were doing this study, pointed to this as one of the more hedonic brands, one of the more sensory-oriented types of retailers. And I want you to notice, too, the limited number of product choices that are here. These displays are not stuffed. They are open, minimalist, if you will. We get a sense here from the mannequins of how these different products work together. And let's contrast that with like Home Depot, which is a very utilitarian brand. Pretty much, here's the product. Not a lot of context here, although we do see a mirror over the vanity, but very much boxes, warehouse type. It really screams that this is a functional product. Now, believe it or not, both Home Depot is selling plants. If we look at these succulents, it's at about a $15, $16 price point, which is, I will agree, a little bit high. But when we look at the succulents that Urban Outfitters is marketing, we're looking at a substantially higher price point. Look at this, $80 for this succulent planter. Now you might say, well, you know, nobody's buying that, or how is that possible? So we did a study where we took the same plants, some of them were succulents and some of them were herbs, and what we did for consumers was identify either the hedonic attributes or the utilitarian attributes, and then we set it in a context, either that was hedonic, much like this, where you see the succulents in a room, or a utilitarian context, which is more like what we see in many garden centers, plants in space. Now, what happened? Let's first look at the plants in the green line with the hedonic attributes. When we primed consumers by putting plants in context, hedonic primacy, we asked people how much they were willing to pay for these plants, and we got a significantly higher price point, $12 for the plant that had hedonic attributes and hedonic primacy. The problem is, when we have hedonic attributes and we put it in utilitarian primacy, notice that consumers were not willing to pay much more than $4. Now, it was interesting to us, not surprising, that plants with utilitarian attributes. We didn't get much of a lift by priming it in that more kind of sensory context. Pretty much the same price, whether it was in hedonic priming or utilitarian priming. Now, what did surprise us was this orange line. When we emphasized both the hedonic and the utilitarian attributes, we got a much lower price point compared to emphasizing the hedonic attributes alone. And so what that tells me is we really need to talk about the sensory experiences of a lot of products. We need to absolutely display use because that points to the utilitarian nature. But to garner that higher premium, to garner that higher profit margin, we need to elevate that sensory experience. So if we've got some fragrant petunias, we need to put them up a little bit higher where consumers can really smell that fragrance, and it would increase that sensory experience. I love the colorful contrast here. They haven't just put hanging baskets in a bunch of rows or flowering shrubs. They've actually created the sense of a front doorway and how that might be decorated with plants. And the same is true here with this deck. So think about in merchandising, obviously we need to have some plants on benches and in rows, but in order to elevate some of these plants to a more premium price point, what we've got to do is to elevate that hedonic nature of those plants and really talk about the beauty, the aromas, the flavors if we're marketing vegetables and herbs. So we accentuate those hedonic attributes and downplay just a bit on some of the more utilitarian attributes. Now, I think a really cool way to do this, especially given the interest in a lot of vegetables and herbs, is to go ahead and dare to cross those botanical lines. You know, I think making this mixed lettuce bowl more attractive, and we can eat the pansies if they're grown in a certain manner. It really elevates it takes some of that utilitarian nature and it really leans more toward the hedonic or aesthetic nature of this particular container. And I know a lot of us are really afraid to cross those botanical lines, but especially given the interest in herbs and vegetables and fruits, I think we need to do this a little bit more often. You know, I see the parsley in here, and it's just, it can be functional, can be pretty, and pretty can be functional. And we can help people who are interested in herbs and vegetables to understand some of the beauty that they might incorporate into their containers or plants. And it also encourages the people who see the beauty of the container, the composition there, that under the right production circumstances, those crops can also be edible. And not necessarily edible and ornamental, but gosh, crossing the botanical boundaries with woody plant material, hydrangeas interspersed here with sweet potato vine. I think we could sell a lot more product if we dared to cross some of those botanical lines. Now I want to turn our attention a little bit to signs. Signage in the retail garden center is really, really important. And I'm not going to say there's any one particular best way to create signs or to arrange signs, but I want to give you some things to think about. Because signage is it reflects the personality of a garden center, and it can be unique. It oftentimes is very special to the garden center. So I'm not prescribing any one best way, but I want you to think about some of the mechanics here and share with you some of the research that we found that we've done to help make those signs more effective. Now, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but angling, just like we angled some of the benches toward consumers, angling some of the signage to where they can easily see them. Now, I like this, but I think it's probably a bit overdone on the signage, you know, because when you look down this row, all you might see are signs. So finding that balance, striking that balance between information and getting that oriented toward the consumer's perspective is a little bit of a challenge. Now let's talk about positioning signs in a display, and I'm going to talk about end caps here for just a minute. Now, a few years ago, we were at a garden center over in the Metro Detroit area, and we were beginning to use, this is the old generation of glasses, we had to have these little sensors here, and we don't need to use them anymore. But we modified a couple of their displays. We started out with where most of the signs were in the center, and I moved this sign to the left side of the display. And what we see down here beneath each of these images is a visual heat map. And what this shows us is the intensity of the visual gaze of the people that we had participate in this particular study. I want you to notice that when that sign was in the center of the display, that was exactly what people were looking at. And one of the biggest cues, one of the biggest pieces of information in the largest type font was the price. Now look what happened when we moved the sign from the center of the display to the left side of the display. We also had some shiny stuff down here. And what that did, and again, you know, I want you to think about how you visually looked at those signs. We were able to divert attention away from that sign information, mainly price, onto something that was visually more interesting, which was attached to the product. And so we felt like this was worth studying. So we've done a couple of studies. I'm going to walk you through this chart because I think there's some really interesting information here. So what we're looking at is the comparison of the time to first fixation. So what this means is how fast did they see a low price, how fast did they see a medium price, and how fast did they physiologically see a high price. All consumers got to that higher price faster than they did a moderate or a low price. So this is pretty compelling information about what most people on average are looking for. And furthermore, what happened was, if we put a high or a moderate price on the left-hand side of the display, physiologically consumers saw it faster than a high or a moderate price on the right-hand side of the display. And this is really important because if we have a high price point, do we really want to draw consumers' attention to that price? I might argue no. If we've got a low price, we definitely want to put that on the left side of the display because consumers saw it physiologically faster on the left than they did on the right. But when we've got high prices and we put them on the left side of the display, we are subconsciously drawing consumers' attention to that particular information. Now, price isn't the only piece of information that we can put in there. And we did another study where, if you look up here, we artificially separated the information. We had information about how that plant was grown, or a production sign. We had information about what that plant was, or the plant identification sign. And we had information about the price, or the price sign. And then we had the plant material underneath each of those three signs. In this study, what we found was almost, well, a majority, about 3/4, made their decision based on the plant material. Physiologically, these people saw the plant material faster than how that plant was grown or what the price was. We're not going to talk too much about the plant identification sign. We put that in the middle just because we kind of wanted to have something that really may not be essential to the purchase. Most people might know what that product was. We had 10% of our consumers who made their decision about whether to buy a plant from that display based upon how that plant was grown. Physiologically, those people got to that information faster. And then my circle here should be a little bit lower on the price sign, because what we saw was people who made their decision based upon price physiologically got to that information faster than the other two segments. So what we can learn here is we do have a segment of the market that is very price sensitive. But why should we make price the headline for everybody else? They're going to find the cue, they're going to find that information that helps them make the decision faster than some of that other information. But if we put benefits, if we put features and benefits in there, we get people to see more about the plant or see more of the plant itself by not calling attention to that price sign. So let's talk about this features and benefits and prices just a little bit more. Now, the sign that we're looking at here focuses mainly on features. And features are very technical attributes or technical dimensions of the product. So for example, these osteospermum were supposed to space 51 to 61 centimeters apart. They grow 25 to 36 centimeters tall. We're supposed to space them 36 to 51 centimeters apart. These are technical aspects of the product, and that is a focus on features. But people buy benefits. They don't buy features. And if we look at this grafted tomato plant sign, we understand the difference between features and benefits. So you might say, well, why would I buy a grafted tomato plant? Well, here are some of the benefits. I might get a higher yield. I probably will have improved resistance to pests, diseases, and stresses. I might have stronger growth. I'm probably going to have larger fruit and a longer harvest season. So what this sign does is it tells us why a grafted plant is better than a non-grafted plant, whereas the osteospermum sign simply tells us what. Now let's look at what happens when we show people features, benefits at high, medium, and low prices. What this graph shows us is the likelihood to buy a product from a display. When we have a very low price point, what helps to sell the product the best is nothing other than the price. And this makes a lot of sense. If we have something that's on sale, if we've discounted something, if it's a real deal, we don't need to add a whole lot of information. We get a greater purchase intention when we have no other information other than the price. Now let's move to a moderate price point. And what we see works best here is the combination of features and benefits. When we just have the price alone at a moderate price point, we get much less likely to buy as we do when we combine the feature and the benefit on the same sign. What happens when we go to that premium or the high price point? We've got to have those benefits, because what is happening here is with the benefit, we're literally translating that value proposition of why people should buy that particular product or service. We are telling them why that is a good deal, and at the moderate price point we tell them the what and the why. Because at the end of the day, most people buy benefits. They don't buy features. Now you might be saying, hey Bridget, I don't know where I can get information on all of the benefits that plants provide to consumers. Well, Charlie Hall and Madeline Dixon did a really nice comprehensive review of all the economic, environmental, and health and well-being benefits associated with the products and services that we sell in the green industry. And if you'd like a free copy of that, all you have to do is send me an email or send Charlie an email. He's more than happy, I'm more than happy to share this with you. And what this article does is it compiles all of the research-based information that Charlie and his graduate student could find. So we've got factual data to support the claims about the economic, environmental, and health and well-being benefits of plants. We need to be using these benefits in our communication materials, particularly signage, when we've got fairly high price points, in order to improve that value proposition of the products that we're merchandising. So I want to move to two more items about content on the signs. We've done some work on environmental benefits, and just a real quick kind of high points of some of the work that we've done. The neonicotinoid issue is still something that is being discussed. When we looked at terminology from bee-friendly to pollinator protectors to protective neonics to traditional pest management strategies, the word that worked the best was bee-friendly. Now, it's interesting to me that we've been having conversations, we've been investigating consumer perceptions of different sustainable and organic management strategies, the term local, and some different alternative containers, compost pots, recycled pots. Really, what trumps many of the eco practices is local. People really resonate with the term local. And what we got was greatest interest on the local compared to organic and sustainable, compared to different types of fertilizers and different types of containers. One more thing, excuse me, one more thing on signs that I want to mention is called image congruency. Far too often, the signs that we show in the retail garden center highlight plants. Now that's a great thing because most of us love our plants, but research will tell us that when people see imagery of people that they identify with or relate to, they're more likely to appreciate that product and more likely to buy that product. And so what we need to do is to show images in the garden center of people interacting with plants. You know, I get to visit a lot of really good retailers throughout the year, and these images are really tough to come by. A couple of the brands, including Proven Winners, has started to show consumers interacting with plants. But you know, this really is not a terribly difficult thing to do if we can identify a local photographer, give that photographer some of the products that we intend to merchandise, and get permission to show, you know, I think I only have, I'm going to go back a slide here. I'm showing mostly children, but we can put adults in these images, and most of us see ourselves as a younger version of ourselves. So I would encourage you to think about the imagery that you're using in the garden center and show people of different ages, people of different ethnic heritages using, interacting, enjoying our products, and that will increase and improve the likelihood that they will relate to that product line, and it will also help increase their odds of purchase. So I want to kind of sum up some of the key points in a few slides here. The first one, visually we need to create a colorful, inviting exterior. The chevron literally points the way into the store. So think about your entryway. It probably wouldn't cost a lot of money to add that chevron point, and I think you're going to have more people subconsciously using that than they would use an entrance sign. So both are nice, but creating that colorful, inviting exterior and having that chevron literally point the way in can be really helpful. I want you to think about your landing space and giving consumers some couple, 5 meters or so of transition space. Now, whether you line this with the special of the week or you kind of make it a little bit more sparse and give them a place to mentally shift gears, think about the landing space and giving people an opportunity to shift gears mentally from the parking lot to the inside of your retail establishment. Help orient them with You Are Here maps and signs in different areas, particularly helping guide them to different types of plant material, where the seasonal containers are. Maybe the perennials are back here. Maybe you have a space that is ideas for inspiration, or the hot sale place. Don't think that it has to be strict botanical lines, but help orient people with a You Are Here dot on the map. Think about, particularly in main aisles or even some of the important secondary aisles, angling some of the benches to give people an inviting perspective down that particular aisleway. Make sure you've got a nice destination at the end, whether that's colorful flags or a tall display or some movement with water. But give them some direction and then help guide them down there by orienting some of those benches at a 45-degree angle so they can see more product to their left and their right without having to turn their neck that 90-degree angle. Think about bench height in a few places and how much more product consumers can possibly view by lowering that some. Now, we don't want to create tripping hazards. We don't want to put everything down that low. We do want to have some variety in the height, but think about how much more perspective could we get if we adjusted, especially some key displays, down a half a meter or a quarter of a meter. In terms of positioning for best viewing, think about some of the signage, particularly if it's at a 90-degree angle on the bench. Is there an opportunity for some of that to be turned upward toward the consumer's eye so they can see more of that information? And one of the studies that we're planning for spring of 2018 is to see how much of that feature benefit information we can get them to read. So stay tuned for more information on that. Think about sign content. Use features and benefits to elevate the perceived value. When the price is high, focus more on those benefits if you can. And if you've got a great deal, don't say anything more than the price. Put high prices on the right side of the display, the right side of the sign, and put sale prices over to the left. Physiologically, people are going to get to those high prices faster, so hey, let's make them work. Let's make them visually find that price after they read some feature and benefit information. Context is really important. We need to elevate the hedonic aspects of our products. Cross those botanical lines. I think we can get a premium price when we make functional beautiful and beautiful also functional. Don't overwhelm them with all the displays chocked full of product. It really does overwhelm them cognitively. They're not seeing much past the first or second row. By the time we look at that 8th or 9th row, it's pretty much invisible to them. Now, I can hear some of you saying, but Bridget, you know, we want to give consumers choices, and I know that's going to take more labor. But if we want to try to simplify the shopping process, some of us in some displays can take the cue from, I showed you the image of Urban Outfitters. There weren't 85 different choices there. There were 4 or 5 different choices. I'm going to encourage you strategically to think about some of that and see what happens. And if your people say, gosh, I have to refill this over and over and over and over again, it's working. It might just work for you. What do we put in terms of a little bit more content? I would absolutely talk about the location of the plants. Sometimes the eco practices help. Remember to cite benefits, not just features, but local, local, local is still the word that is going to resonate more with most people. And show people enjoying the products you have on display to enhance their image congruency, to help enhance their relatability to the product, because this is going to get them more interested, more likely to buy, spending just a little bit more time with that product. So I want to say a couple of thank yous before I take some questions. So we had one corporate sponsor this year, Masterpiece Flower Company, and a lot of the research that I showed you was also funded by the USDA Federal State Marketing Improvement Grant Program, the Horticultural Research Institute, and Michigan State University's Project Green. And if you want to get some more information, I am starting a podcast in December 2017. It's free. The website is up and running now. It's Connect to Consumer. So if you want to get any of the really long details about some of the research studies, you can log on to Connect to Consumer and get some of the full articles there. So with that, I think we'll see what questions might have arisen during the webinar.
Awesome, thanks, Bridget. So the first one I've got here was, did you find there was any any certain color that contributed to eye draw, or was it primarily price and benefits as you talked about?
That's a good question. We have not investigated color yet. What we plan to do next year is to work with the word sale and see if we can get, if a sale sign is in red, and almost all of us see sale signs in red, to see if we can get people to visually see that sale sign faster if it's in red than black. But we have not done, we did a little bit of work with container color. We had yellow, green, and white containers. Now, if you've got to think about this a little bit, so the container really isn't the primary thing that they're looking at, but we didn't see any difference in time to first fixation of those 3 different container colors. But we absolutely have tons more that we could do with color. So thank you for that question.
Okay. What factor played the biggest role in the actual purchase?
It depended on how the consumer made their purchase decision. What we saw in most studies, it is the type of plant, but there still is a segment, and it depends on which research study I point to. You can get from 10 to 25% of the total market being very, very price sensitive. So plant still is the big decision point. Price is a part of that equation, and after that, I think we get into a lot of the features turned into benefits, and I really want to emphasize those benefits, because most people, when they understand what a feature does for them, that really can be a tipping point in terms of their likeliness to buy a product. You know, just saying something doesn't require deadheading, you know, translate that into the benefit of no maintenance or very low maintenance. People go, oh wow, I can get flower color all summer long and I don't have to go out there and do anything. That's really the biggest tipping point in getting customers to make that product decision. Now, If they don't like the product in the first place, that's not going to get them to buy it. So it's an affinity for the plant or the look of the plant, and then kind of secondarily we'll see the price and the benefit kind of wrestling depending on who's doing the choosing.
Okay, you might have already answered this next question in that kind of in that answer there, but where did you find a correlation with where people's eyes had to stay longer in order to equal a purchase?
You know, we're actually working on that. One of the things that we're doing with the 6, 12, and 24 plant study is looking at the path or the pattern. So we want to know if it's the thing that they looked at first, last, or the longest. And I have to tell you, stay tuned because we're working on that analysis as we speak.
Okay. What have you seen for farmers market retail displays? Similar idea, or maybe if you haven't looked at it, have you seen it? Has anybody else looked at it? Do you know?
No, but you know, I've noticed, and when I teach a marketing class, I'm teaching it right now, and when we do talk about the markets, I've noticed that the color contrast between the produce and the, let's just call it display fabric or display container. So some of the better ones have a nice neutral green fabric or container. And the other thing I see is the baskets or the bins being tilted toward the eyes. And, you know, it goes right along with some of the things that we talked about with bench height and angling the signs towards consumers. So the color contrast in produce is important, having it clean, but then having it on a neutral green or a neutral dark fabric or whatever the covering is, and then angling some of those bins toward consumer eyes really, really helps.
Okay. Another question regarding color here, and this might be something that you're working on as well. There's been a lot of talk about color blocking in the industry. So rather than organizing via, like we talked about, like annuals over here, perennials over here, sun-loving ones over here, shade-loving ones over here, putting them together so that consumers have an easier idea of how to coordinate the colors.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Is that something that you're seeing, or would you think in your estimate, would that be increasing sales? Would that be adding to customer confusion?
I see it increasing sales, and kind of another piece to that is putting up a color wheel where consumers who maybe are looking for that bold contrast can understand a little bit more about picking opposite colors on the color wheel, and somebody who wants a more subtle contrast could pick more proximate colors.
Nice, good idea, excellent. Okay. If there's no more questions, doesn't appear to be. But anyways, if there's no more, I'll let you know that the recording for this will be available at our microsite along with the previous one. I've been horribly remiss at that, but it's www.agriculture.alberta.ca/horticulture. An evaluation will be sent to you shortly, and it would be appreciated if you could please fill it out, as your opinion does matter, and you can disregard any evaluation after the webinar because it's generally related to the software. So once again, thanks to Bridget for the wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of you who took time out of your busy day to listen. Hopefully you can join us in a couple weeks when we're back on November 20th, and we'll have Ronald Valentin from BioLine, and he's going to be talking about the use of biological controls in a field environment. So thanks, and have a wonderful day, folks.
Thank you.